You're listening to Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm talking with Dr. Rebecca Hernandez and Renee Howell. Dr. Rebecca Hernandez is Mexican-American and Mescalero Apache. She is the director of the American Indian Resource Center at UC Santa Cruz. She holds an MFA in Exhibition Design and Museum Studies, and an MA in American Indian Studies, as well as a doctorate in American Studies. Dr. Hernandez is a first-generation college student and is honored to lead the American Indian Resource Center team in their efforts to retain and inspire Native students at UC Santa Cruz. Renee Howell is affiliated with the Quapaw Tribe of Oklahoma and a fourth-year undergraduate student majoring in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. She's also a second-year intern with the UC Santa Cruz's American Indian Resource Center. Renee is from Yuba City, California. She's passionate about issues within Native communities, particularly those concerning access to education, traditional foods, and cultural language revitalization. She's on her way to being the first in her family to graduate college, and she hopes to work towards increasing the number of Native students who go into STEM disciplines and fields. I've invited them to discuss the epidemic of violence against Native women in the United States, especially as we near the May 5th Day of Remembrance about missing and murdered indigenous women. Thank you both so much for coming to Voces Críticas. Dr. Hernandez, let's start with you. Even though the data collected on violence against Native women in the United States is not as comprehensive as it should be, what the data that has been collected does reveal to us are very grim statistics, including that 84% of Native women have experienced violence in their lifetime. What's your reaction when you hear such a high percentage of violence against Native women?
The unfortunate reality for Native people is that this is not much of a surprise to us. We know that there's a lot of violence, not just on reservations, but also in border towns. That's where a lot of the violence takes place. And then there's such a large urban Indian population. Native women are also victimized in those spaces. So it is sad. And also, I think for me, we need to continue working toward educating our men and women about how to engage with one another, because violence against women is just, unacceptable. But in Indian country, I think we're dealing with so many complicated issues. And the way that Indian people are forced to live in rural and reservation areas, they're isolated. There's a lot of opportunity for violence because there's very little police protection on reservations. So it's frightening and it's sad and really demoralizing sometimes. I do want to mention that Native women who are assaulted in urban areas, and they report the crime to police in their neighborhood or wherever they might be, that's where some statistics get lost as well, because they may or may not document the ethnicity of the women, or they may change the ethnicity of the women. I mean, that happens a lot with me because I'm Mexican and Native. For some reason, people think it's easier to document me one way or the other. I don't know why. So because of that, a lot of the stats get lost. When people are bi-ethnic or multiple ethnicities and they say they're Native, sometimes it's recorded as Native, sometimes it's not. So we know we're losing a lot of information there.
And Renee, do you think enough young people, your peers, Native and non-Native, are they aware of how widespread violence against Native women is in this country?
I think that people my age, especially in Native communities, we're understanding now that it's up to us to take a stand against these type of issues. But I don't know that outside of the Native community that it's really being spread as much as it should be. I was tabling for MMIW, and I had people coming up to me and asking about it, and they had no idea. And when I told them the statistics, they were astounded. And I think it's through things like this where we're having conversations about it and raising awareness that it's really the way to get through to people.
Futures Without Violence, based in San Francisco, put together a fact sheet on violence against Native women in particular. And they said, quote, federal government studies have consistently shown that American Indian women experience much higher levels of sexual violence than other women in the U.S. And so, Dr. Hernandez, how do we take that context, that reality, and not reifying a narrative, potentially pathologize Native communities? How do we navigate that tension?
It's easy to forget that all throughout the history of contact, all of our colonial history, violence has been a means by which we've been controlled. And that went from oppressor to community, and then the men in our communities taking on some of that behavior. And there have always been women who remind our communities, both in our immediate communities and outside in urban areas, that we have had fierce leaders. Women have always been leaders in our communities. Women have always been the center because we're the creators. I think in our communities, we have always held a special place. And though a lot of that has been forgotten, what we do know is that it's through the efforts of really committed women to carry the message out to the world that, this has to stop. And one of the first things I think we have to do is work with our boys and the young men in our communities and remind them that we step away from violent behavior and learn how to do things through conversation and through other means. We gain our liberty.
This point you just made about masculinity, how do we acknowledge it's normal to be angry about injustice and yet be mindful of not being consumed by that anger too?
One way that is really healing is to go back to your traditional ways, to go back to ceremony, to relearn. There's been a lot of talk in modern times about unlearning, toxic masculinity. And in Native communities, we have beautiful ways of doing that. You can go back and learn your traditional food ways, or you can learn how to do traditional artwork. And there's a lot of movement towards revitalizing these things. And if we can start channeling this anger and all of this trauma into revitalizing our own ways, then we can undo a lot of what colonial settlerism has done.
And I think also, because it's my life's work to encourage folks to go to college, I know that that's a huge step for a lot of people, especially women. We still have very, very low numbers. It's less than 1% in the United States. Less than 1% of all college students are Native. But that is a step in the right direction. Every student that I work with comes with a story about how they got here, and 99% of them are first-generation students. But we have to be those brave warriors and step into a place that we're unfamiliar with and try to find a way to use our own voice, whether that be through the love of law, the arts, STEM, like Renee and other members of our team. In whatever ways you find that excitement and passion, there is a way to do good in Indian country. Every Native student that I get to know and that I get to witness graduate is a statement about what a brighter future we have.
You hear these dire statistics and you think it's hopeless. There's nothing to do. We can't do anything about it. But you both have said, actually, we know what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. I think it's not only about toxic masculinity, it's also about engaging the girls and the women and having also an understanding that I don't deserve to be treated this way. Mm-hmm. And so what do you think we can do in that regard about not only working with young boys, but what about for girls and young women, Native women? What do you think?
I would say to start off with is defining what domestic violence is. I feel like a lot of young women come into adulthood not knowing what a non-toxic relationship is. And so they come in and they're young and they're naive and they get involved in these relationships and they don't know that that's how they're not supposed to be treated. So I think that to start off with, we need to have dialogue. We need to have real, honest conversations about it's not appropriate for him to throw things when he gets mad. That's a sign and you need to get out. And these are resources that can help you do that. And again, like Dr. H said, reservations don't tend to have all of these huge resources abound, and finding ways to bring resources onto reservations, especially regarding domestic violence, since I think the statistic is 80% of Native women face domestic violence at some point in their life. So why don't we have resources on reservations to help Native people with this particular dilemma?
Creating resources for our communities, even if we're not living there. That's something that I try to do with the cultural aspects of my tribe. But, there are so many things online, and every reservation has access to at least one computer with internet. And, just telling educators on reservations or educators in border towns, these are resources that you can just go to on the internet. You don't have to have a center. You don't have to have somebody specially trained. But, there's a lot of places online where you can learn about domestic violence, where you can watch videos and have really great explanations of what's appropriate in a relationship and how you can grow healthy young people into functioning adults. And also, oftentimes we know that this violence is accompanied by drinking and drugs. And that's another component where we can teach our young people, when you choose to engage in those things, you're not just hurting yourself, but everybody around you is suffering.
You're listening to Dr. Rebecca Hernandez, director of the American Indian Resource Center at UC Santa Cruz. She's Mexican-American and Mescalero Apache. You're also listening to Renee Howell, who is affiliated with the Quapaw Tribe of Oklahoma and a fourth-year undergraduate student majoring in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology. Renee, when did you become aware of this epidemic of violence against Native women, and how do you connect this to the larger history about violence against Native communities more broadly?
Probably the most standout moment in recognizing violence against Native women came to me when I was actually visiting family in Ontario, Canada. And I was on the Nashiming Reservation there, and we were at a powwow, and these folks came up and they made an announcement that they were going to do a prayer walk across Canada in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women. When I got to talk to them, they quantified it for me, we have this idea that there is violence going on, and family members are going missing, and loved ones are going missing, and friends. And when I spoke to them and they told me why they were doing this, because the epidemic is very similar in Canada, that was when it became real for me. And after that, we collected donations for them to help them with their prayer walk. These people were entirely grassroots. They were just doing this because they felt so passionately about the issue.
Were you in high school, or how old were you then?
That was 2 years ago now. Yeah. So that was 2 years ago when I got to do that. And as far as the connection to broader violence against Native communities, there's been violence since first contact. And I think the reason why this violence has continued is because those stereotypes that initiated the first violence have been just continuing past generationally. Nobody is stopping to say, no, those aren't right, or no, Native people are all not Plains Indians, there's so much diversity within Native peoples. And I think if people stopped to identify that as one factor and recognize, not all Native people live on reservations. 71% of Native people are urban Indians. I grew up urban, Dr. Hernandez grew up urban. And recognizing that when you're in a space, you could be in a space with a Native person, and that we hear your comments, and that we know your bias, and we see that on the daily basis. And I think that as we engage with these kind of topics, it's important for folks to recognize what they don't know, because when they're speaking on these issues from a place of ignorance, the context that they give it continues this idea that, Native people are all poor, or they're all drunkards, or all of these negative stereotypes that are associated with Native people. And not all of them are true. That might be true for one Native person, but that might also be true for one white person. So you can't just lump Native people as one being.
Right, as a monolith, right?
Yeah,
as
exactly.
a sort of a homogenous kind of group. And I think that's such an important point, Renee, because there is this tendency to pathologize Native people when we think about alcoholism or drug abuse as if that's somehow unique to Native communities rather than who has access to resources for recovery. These epidemics or these, forms of drug and alcohol abuse linger longer because there is not the resources or the cultural competence resources for communities to get the help that they need. According to a 2007 Amnesty International report, which was called The Maze of Injustice, they wrote, quote, "Women who come forward to report sexual violence are caught in a jurisdictional maze that federal, state, and tribal police often cannot quickly sort out. There's 3 justice systems, tribal, state, and federal, that are all potentially involved in responding to sexual violence against Indigenous women. 3 main factors determine which of these justice systems has the authority to prosecute such crimes. 1, whether the victim is a member of a federally recognized tribe or not, whether the accused is a member of a federally recognized tribe or not, and 3, whether the offense took place on a tribal land or not. The answers to these questions, Amnesty International wrote, are often not self-evident, and there can be significant delays while police, lawyers, and courts establish who has jurisdiction over a particular crime," end quote. So it's not as easy as just reporting the crime. So can you explain, Dr. Hernandez, how these different justice systems are causing further harms against Native women, structural harms against Native women?
Well, I would love to say that I can, but there are people who dedicate their whole lives to tribal law and this particular situation. But the best way to explain it is that tribal lands are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. So the FBI are called in anytime there's supposed to be called in Whether they show up, how often they're willing to come out, it all factors in because it's very expensive to send agents out to reservations. Then you have tribal police who are overworked, under-resourced, and then you have local police who oftentimes, in my personal experience, using I statements, I have seen that, they often can be very cavalier and indifferent because they just see things over and over and over again and they lose compassion. So those three things are also factors. And Renee and I and the team have been doing research on what we would want to talk about or what things we would want to recommend for people. And the film Wind River, though violent and complicated and, a Hollywood film, actually did a really great job, especially in regard to jurisdiction issues. And I think very poignantly told the story of two families who'd lost daughters. Women really at a very special time in their lives, just finishing up high school. And it was profound and so meaningful to us that it was in theaters, but it can be streamed. And so if your listeners are interested in learning more about the jurisdiction issue, they certainly could turn to that film.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out, just to clarify for anybody that doesn't really know, if you're a non-native and you go on to native land, to a reservation, and you commit a crime, there's not much that the tribal police can do. And again, that's under the jurisdiction of the FBI. And then the FBI, it doesn't always, show up for these types of violent crimes. In fact, there's a statistic that says in 2016, 5,712 Native women went missing, but only 116 were ever even logged in police database. And if that doesn't say something about the work being done, if those are the ones that are logged, then how many have we, like Dr. H was saying, how many were misidentified ethnically? We've lost the number of women for that. How many women were just not incorporated, or how many women went missing and nobody said anything? And there's so many factors into that number that's probably an underestimate. And if this was happening with any other ethnicity, you would hear those statistics everywhere. But when they're happening in Native communities, I think we're just not looking at it through the same lens.
I think one of the themes you've been talking about is the ways in which Native women are rendered invisible or silenced, etc. Renee, you are in a discipline that does not have a lot of Native students in them or professionals in them. And one of your passions is working towards increasing the number of Native students who enter these STEM fields and these STEM disciplines. Can you talk about what your experience has been as a STEM student and why it's so important to increase the representation of Native students in these fields?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who can't see me, I'm very white passing. So I have this kind of weird experience where I'm in these spaces and people don't recognize that there's a Native person sitting 2 feet in front of them. So I think I've witnessed firsthand a lot of microaggressions towards Native people, but without having a target. So they're just general ideologies that kind of get put into the air. And I think the fact that people don't assume that there's a Native person in the room is problematic in of itself. That is a form of erasure. Just not acknowledging that, yes, you can have a Native student in your, molecular biology class. Yeah, that happens. And I think also I've had times where I've been tabling for the AIRC and I've had professors that I've had walk up and be like, I had no idea this existed. I think professional staff and faculty should be aware of resources available for their students. And so that also plays into the fact that if you don't know how to help your students in a way that is culturally relevant for them, then that is also another reason why Native students aren't pursuing these kind of things. And science as we know it currently, or as I'm studying it, is a very westernized version of science. And I think that's why a lot of Native students are put off by it, because westernization has been so traumatic. And then taking the time to engage with these topics daily and hear about how these white old men that contributed to the colonization of your people were the ones that found, DNA, And so I think we need to work towards validating indigenous knowledge in hard sciences in order to increase the number of Native students that we've got coming in. Because Native people do have a unique perspective on science, and I think that can contribute. We're going back now, and scientists are saying that all of these observations made by Native people hundreds and hundreds of years ago are valid. Mm-hmm. And now they're putting theories and fancy names to these ideas. But indigenous knowledge has been aware of it for centuries. And so I think it's managing this duality. Yes, I'm a woman in STEM, but I'm also a Native woman in STEM. And I think it's really important that as Native people that are engaging in these topics, that we are outspoken about our identities and that we're engaging in the way that we are.
You're right. Dr. Hernandez, I mean, she's amazing. You were amazing. You're right there. I'm not going to talk about legacy around here. But I just think you and I have been through graduate school. And so we know the importance of what it means to not just be at the table as women of color, as Native women, as Indigenous women, but to actually shape the research from the questions that get asked to the communities that become part of our studies or become part of our investigations, et cetera, that when we talk about the increasing the representation, in this case, of Native students in STEM, we're also asking not only for the incorporation, I think, of Indigenous knowledges, but to ask different questions. It's about actually having Native students inform the research questions and the research studies.
Right. And Native faculty and Native staff. You know, I made a deliberate decision to attend UNM because the Native faculty and Native student body was enormous compared to any other university I was considering for grad school. So that made a huge difference. You know, I could sit down with a Native scholar and I didn't have to start from zero. You know, they understood why I had a particular passion or frustration or joy in the work I was doing. And just coming back to, you know, seeing change, this year we saw 2 women elected into Congress that are Native. And my sisters, I come from a very large family. My sisters and I were kind of following that day, watching their families be present as they were sworn in. And just what a momentous, I mean, it was just such a profound day. And knowing that my little nieces were watching that. There's now 2 women that are doing work directly related to what we're talking about today. But it feels really exciting to me that that's finally happened. And of course, our hope is that as the first people of this country, we would have a lot more in the future. But we're so proud of them.
I agree. You can see the legislation they're trying to push. Mm-hmm. You can see the questions that they're trying to ask. I mean, if they were not there, those questions would not be asked. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's also about access and presence, but it's also shaping the legislation. It's shaping the debates. I mean, this is why this was such a kind of a monumental year.
Yes.
I think for congressional representation. Thank you both so much for coming. I don't know if you have any final comments that you would like to share or end.
There are 3 women graduating this year who've worked for my team, and they're all amazing, all women who are members of tribes, and I'm so proud of them. And every year, I just, you know, we get to spring quarter, and it feels like the closer we get to the date of graduation, the more excited I get because I know the future they're going to create for us because they're amazing people. So everybody out there that has a Native grad in their life, just hug them today because they are going to make a difference for us. And we're really proud of you all.
And Renee.
This might seem a little like out of left field, but because this is airing in California and people are in this space, I just wanted to point out that San Francisco is one of the top 10 urban locations for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I don't think we recognize that. Like, we live in this space, we live on this land, and we go about our days like the Indigenous people here aren't being affected by our presence. And even as an Indigenous person, this isn't my traditional homeland. Like, my traditional homeland is in Arkansas. I'm not where my ancestors are from. And so I think we really need to take a step back in our daily lives and just recognize, like, yes, I'm here. Yes, my presence is definitely felt by the people that were originally here. And what am I doing today to stop the violence or to prevent the violence that my presence could be causing?
Yeah. And we could, you know, all of us have a responsibility in that way. Thank you both so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.